like to see in China. And for the Chinese companies, they do not have sufficient knowledge about the investment environment, investment policies, and in particular the security review policies in the United States. And given what happened to some cases related to security review in the United States happened to Chinese companies trying to make an investment here, we've got the feeling that there is a lack of transparency in your security review policies. And one of the investment hurdles for the Chinese companies trying to make investment here is that they are short of talented people. Actually, to make investment is just like spend money. It is not easy at all to spend money, and it is even harder to try to get a bigger bang of your money. So for the Chinese companies, they really face the issue of how to well spend their money. And it is very difficult for Chinese companies to have those capable people who understand at the same time the domestic situation, their particular industry, and the situation here in the United States.
You have said that the thing that could get in the way of U.S.-Chinese relations is fear, not so much a disagreement over specific policy.
I think, you see this risk of Americans concerned that China's rise will come at our expense. And you see in China some concern that the objective of U.S. policy is to contain China's rise. Both those perceptions, I think, are false, and they pose risk to both of us. And I think part of what we have to do is try to demonstrate to the citizens of both countries that as we work to advance and protect and defend our interests vis-a-vis each other, that we can do that and still find a way we can grow together. And that's I think it's going to be the great challenge of the coming decades for both these two countries. And that's why we're investing so much time and effort into trying to make sure that we understand China's interests, its intentions, their values and traditions, and ask them to do the same for the United States, because that'll help us avoid the kind of miscalculations that would raise the odds of future tension.
Secretary Geithner has said what Secretary Kissinger has said to me, that many Chinese believe the United States wants to contain their growth and development. Do you believe that?
Does the United States want to contain China's development? Actually, during President Hu Jintao's visit to the United States, the U.S. government and President Obama himself said on many occasions that the United States hoped to see prosperity and development in China and believed that this would serve the world and the United States. I believe in what your president said.
What do you think the biggest misconception about your country is from America in general?
I don't think this is misconception. It is more of a lack of understanding.
What do you want us to understand?
Well, in the first place, it is not easy to really know China, because China is an ancient civilization and we are of the Oriental culture. And for the Americans, the United States is the world's #1 superpower. And the American people, they're very simple people. If they're asked to choose to understand a foreign country, their first choice would be the European countries, and the South American countries may come second. It was not only till recent years that the American people have begun to pay more attention to China. But over the years, American media coverage of China have been scarce, and if there were some coverage, most of them are lopsided.
What do you think about this question of misconception and understanding?
The thing about America and the world is that our role in the world, we took on this huge role in the world well ahead of the understanding of Americans about what's happening in the world, and that's changing now. And, when I went to China to study Chinese about 30 years ago, it was a unique, exceptional thing. And now, of course, there's tens of thousands of Americans studying in China, studying Chinese all across the United States. And you're starting to see a much greater investment by Americans in understanding, not just China, but all the countries that are so important to our interests. And it's come a little late to the United States, but it's changing quickly now. And I think it's very important because our capacity to advance our interests as a country will depend much more now going forward on the quality of understanding we can bring to these basic problems. That starts with understanding, again, the basic interests and traditions, values and intentions of a country like China.
With respect, there was a story in the New York Times today suggesting that there was, despite this good dialogue taking place here, in China, a real sense of crackdown on artists and on foreign, out of some fear or some concern about the United States or some Arab Spring kind of ideas coming to China.
I don't think it is possible for events like Arab Spring to take place in China. That might be the conclusion of your State Department. I understand that there has been frequent exchange of views between your State Department and China's Foreign Ministry on the situation in North African and West Asian countries, but we've said on many occasions that it is not possible for things like for things in West Asia and North African countries to take place in China.
It's interesting to be sitting here with Secretary Geithner because he understands Mandarin. Human rights will come up in this conversation.
Of course, as always. You know, again, we have to recognize we come from different political traditions, have different political systems, and as you heard the Vice President and the Secretary of State say today, you've heard the President say in the past, we convey our concerns on these issues as you'd expect us to do. But our part of these discussions are about the broader economic and financial challenges facing the global economy. And we're doing a reasonable job of trying to make sure we find the right balance between China's interests and our interests. It's not perfect. We have our moments of tension. Try to calm the tension where we can so we can make more progress. But I think we're doing a good job of trying to make sure we're expanding opportunities for both countries. And that's very important to us as we recover in the United States. Because, you know, as we come out of this crisis, we want to make sure that export growth is as strong as it can. That'll translate into more Americans back to work more quickly. And that's what we're spending all our time talking about.
If, in fact, this domestic demand develops, because China's had this extraordinary rise of a middle class with buying capacity, and that's been true in other emerging nations as well, does it offer real opportunities for American business to serve that market? And as part of the argument you're trying to make is that make sure there's a level playing field in order to give them an opportunity.
Absolutely, and you know, that's what you see happening now. That's why we're exporting so much to China already, and that's why our exports are growing so rapidly, and that's why we're so confident that if you look forward to the future, you're going to see even more jobs in the United States today created because of the need for us to meet that growing demand we're seeing in China. So, again, if you look at what's happening in agriculture, in manufacturing, in services, in advanced technology, U.S. companies have a major stake in what's happening in China. Of course, we want to make sure those opportunities expand, but they matter for us because they translate directly into better opportunity for American workers as we come out of this crisis.
What is the reason for his interest in technology? Is that a national security issue, or why do many Chinese officials feel like they're not getting a fair shake?
Well, China recognizes that China's capacity to grow in the future depends on making sure they can move up that technological frontier. And so they are, you know, they've got an incredibly creative group of scientists and innovators in China, but of course they'd like to also take advantage of technology that was designed and developed in the United States, and so they're trying to very aggressively make sure they have more access to that technology. Now, on our side, we have a set of very careful protections put in place to try to make sure that the technology that's most sensitive for our national security interests doesn't end up in the hands of people that shouldn't have it. Now, we're trying to reform and modernize those controls, and as we relax those controls, I think China's going to find it easier to access some advanced technology in the United States, but we're still going to retain and restrict access to the most advanced technologies with the greatest military sensitivity, as you'd expect. But, you know, China, is interested in more access to high technology in the United States, more opportunity to invest in U.S. companies with high technology. That's what you'd expect them to do. And I think over time, you're going to see China get more opportunity, more access in that area.
When you look at this relationship, what is your worry, or are you essentially optimistic?
My biggest worry is that economic relations between China and the United States become politicized. As the head of the economic dialogue from China, this is my biggest concern. Because once economic issues are politicized, they're no longer economic issues. If we're to look at China and the United States, the world's biggest developed country and the world's biggest developing country, the intertwining of our interests is enormous, and we face great opportunities for cooperation. Both countries have their problems in terms of transforming economic growth pattern and promoting economic cooperation. We face a lot of opportunities. If economic issues are no longer economic issues and become political ones, such opportunities of cooperation may well be lost. So the most important thing for the two of us to do is to depoliticize the economic issues and see economic relations between China and the U.S. as they are. In this way, we will truly reflect the nature of a comprehensive and mutually beneficial economic relationship between China and the United States. China has a population of 1.3 billion. Our GDP is now the world's second largest, but in terms of both hard power and soft power, there is still a big gap between China and the United States. What is even more important is that when we look at the per capita numbers, China's per capita GDP is ranking around the 100th in the world. This is something that has never happened to the world before. This is a very unique circumstance. There has never been one single country in the world with a second largest GDP, but with a per capita GDP that is ranking around the 100th. You mentioned the issue of the exchange rate. Talking about the exchange rate, there's one thing I wish to let your viewers know. In China, a lot of people have made a comparison between our economic relations with the United States and Japan's economic relations with the United States. A lot of people in the United States actually made such comparison. The five differences, among the five differences, two of them were raised by Larry Summers. When I came to the United States, he told me that when talking about China-U.S. trade surplus and Japan-U.S. trade surplus back then, some things are different, actually. First, Japan's trade surplus with the U.S. back then, in terms of its manufacturing technologies, they were at or above the level of technologies in the United States. It is not this case when we talk about China-U.S. trade. Chinese technologies are lagging behind the United States. Second, back then, American consumers could well remember those Japanese brand names, such as Nissan, Toyota, and Sony, and so on. But for the American consumers, they could not remember too many Chinese brand names. The only thing they could remember about Chinese products is that they are made in China. The third difference, actually, this was told to me by the central bank governor of Japan, he added this third difference upon hearing the two differences mentioned by Larry Summers. He told me that in the Japanese-American trade surplus, most of the surplus was contributed by Japanese companies solely. But it is a different story in China-US surplus. More than 60% of our surplus with the United States is contributed by foreign invested companies or multinationals from US, from Europe, from Japan. The products are simply processed in China and then exported to the United States. That is why recently some experts say that it is better to say that products are created in the world but only made in China. That is to say, a large part of our surplus with the U.S. comes from processing trade, and the core components of those exports come from developed countries. Take the iPhone of the Apple company as an example. It sells several $100 each, but only $30 or $40 were actually created in terms of value added in China. So it was better to describe the Apple products as created in the United States but only made in China. And the fourth difference between Japan-US surplus and China-US surplus is that the United States did not have an export control vis-à-vis Japan. That is to say, it is possible for the Japanese to buy virtually anything from the United States, including planes, cannons, and warships. But this is not possible for China. Many of the American products, as mentioned by Secretary Geithner just now, because of security reasons, could not be exported to China. And for the Chinese people, when we look at the trade balance issue with the United States, the Americans are complaining about our exchange rate. And the Chinese people are saying that this is because you have your good stuff, but you will not sell them to us. So this is the fourth difference. And on top of this, there is another difference, the fifth difference. Now China is the world's second largest trading country. Actually, the largest trading country. But even so, the U.S. has yet to recognize China as a market economy. Not even the United States, the Europeans, the Japanese. They have yet to recognize China as a market economy. But back in the days when Japan was running a surplus to you, you recognized Japan as a market economy long before.
I agree, by the way, that the Japanese comparison is not a good comparison. Right. I also agree that it'd be good if we could try to take the politics out of economics. Right. Very hard to do. Just listen to the fiscal debate in the United States. It's hard to take the politics out of economics. I think the most important thing we can do, again, is just try to demonstrate and explain that we are working to address the problems that exist between us to make sure that both citizens in both countries view the playing field as fair and even. That's the best thing we can try and do. And I think we're making progress in that.
And at the same time, as he's said and others have said, to make sure that anyone knows that the United States is trying hard to begin to deal with its long-term fiscal problems.
Yeah, I think the very important thing for Americans to understand that by far and away, the most important factor that will determine the extent to which we benefit from China's rise will be the policies we pursue in the United States to make sure that we're strengthening our long-term growth fundamentals, better education, stronger incentives for innovation and investment, and of course, restoring fiscal sustainability. Overwhelmingly, what's going to determine America's relative strength in the world, vis-a-vis China, vis-a-vis other countries, will be the quality of judgments our political system delivers in economic policy. And as you know, that's fundamentally a political challenge.
And have they, in a sense, recognized, has there been an appreciation of what the decisions that have been made with respect to coming out of the economic crisis?
Well, you should ask the Chinese that question. I think most people look at the United States, they saw us go through a terribly damaging terribly risky financial crisis at substantial consequence damage to the rest of the world. But they also saw us do what Americans always do, which is confronted with crisis. We moved very aggressively to fix our problems, and as a result, we're going to come out of this, I believe, much stronger than we were before the crisis. And again, the great strength of the United States is our resilience, the speed at which we adjust, the force of reforms, the quickness of action. And, you know, we made a lot of progress, but we got a lot of work to do.
What you're seeing here is someone trying to deal with, characterize the Vice Premier for us.
Well, again, I think he recognizes that China's interests lie with the world and are inextricably linked with the United States and its other trading partners. And China's key challenge is to balance its own reform challenges, its own very substantial economic challenges, with the needs of the world as a whole. And they're going to find that balance. It's going to change over time, but they'll find that balance.
I was recently with Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore. He said that you were the person that he most liked to deal with in China. He paid enormous compliments to you. He said, I hope he will stay at his position and will not retire and will be there because he's as good as he had seen.
The one I like to do business with is Wang QI SHAN.
I thought you'd say that. There is talk that he may stay on even though he's 65.
Well, if I were them, I'd keep him on. They haven't got anybody near him. Practical, hard-headed, humorous, quick repartee, and makes the right decisions from the Chinese point of view.
When you were meeting with him, did he still have a statue of Confucius on his table?
Yes.
Back in the 90s, I had a conversation with him back in his office. What impressed me the most was the statue of Confucius on the top of his table. Mr. Lee Kuan Yew had succeeded in finding a path of the development of a city-state. He made use of both the Oriental culture and the Western culture. In a certain sense, in terms of culture, he made more use of the Eastern culture, but in terms of institutions, he made more use of the British system.
As I thank you for coming today, you said to me, thank Secretary Geithner. Secretary Geithner said, there he is again, looking for leverage.
It is not till now that I feel a little bit more used to this way of conversation with a earphone.
Exactly.
We'll do more of it.
So we can do more?
Yeah, we'll do more of it.
we shall do this again. Good. My friends in China also say about you that you are a man who loves a quick repartee and that you're a great student of history. So perhaps we can talk more about economics, but also history the next time.
That's for sure.
Francis Fukuyama is here. He is an author. He is a senior fellow at Stanford University. He is most well known for his work, The End of History and The Last Man. His new book is called The Origins of Political Order. It looks at political institutions from pre-human times up until the eve of the French and American revolutions. I'm very pleased to have him back at this table. Welcome.
Thank you.
Let me start with a dedication here to Samuel Huntington. And when he talked of the clash of civilization, is the judgment of his argument and his writing today that it has been confirmed, it has been rejected, or it is misunderstood?
Well, I didn't like that argument as much as some of his other earlier arguments, because I always thought that there are more universal values than he was willing to concede. I sort of think that the Arab Spring, in a way, is evidence in the other direction, because he said that there's something about Muslim culture that would really make it different in its development from things going on in the West or Asia. And I think what I perceive in places like Egypt and Tunisia is that people don't like living under authoritarian governments there any more than anyone else does in the world. And they're joining the party a little bit late, but they're going to participate.
And you suggested before I sat down that they were influenced by, one, their education, and the fact that they have more access to information and events.
Right. That's right. Well, in 1968, Huntington's first book, I think is still his greatest, was a book called Political Order in Changing Societies. And that's precisely what he argued, because there's a whole lot of instability then in the developing world, coups and civil wars. And he was saying, well, actually, they're not staged by the poorest of the poor. They're staged by middle-class people that have gotten educations, and then they're not allowed to participate. They don't have job opportunities, and they're the ones that are dangerous in a society.
And then there is what you wrote about the end of history and The Last Man. Would you say that the judgment of history about that book and those ideas has been confirmed, rebutted, or in fact misunderstood?
Well, I think the argument looks better because a lot of my a lot of my critics said, look, you're forgetting about September 11th and the fact that there's this whole part of the world that isn't going to participate in this global democratic revolution. Now, we're not out of the woods yet, and we don't have good democracies in the Arab world at the moment. But I think in a lot of ways the impulse is there, and it's shown that this argument about there being a cultural exception in either Muslim countries or Arab countries is really not true.
And your argument was that, in fact, after the fall of the Berlin Wall and all of that, that it was a triumph of liberal democracy.
I think actually that despite this initial impulse towards democracy, we've actually been disappointed in a lot of places. Like a good example is the Ukraine. In 2004, you had the Orange Revolution that looked a lot like these demonstrations in Egypt and Tunisia. They got rid of an old communist apparatchik that had stolen an election, but they couldn't deliver on good government. They squabbled, new democratic leaders squabbled among themselves, and the very guy that stole that election in 2004 just got elected.
Now, when he got re-elected, did he come wearing a different badge and a different argument?
A little bit. I mean, he had moderated a little bit, but he's basically the same, guy, I think, with basically authoritarian instincts. And so, in a way, it was a huge disappointment because the democratic forces really couldn't create durable institutions.
So there is somewhere a gap between the instinct for democratic and liberal democracies, whatever that means, and the capacity to create them and to maintain them and sustain them.
That's right. And the gap is called an institution. An institution is something durable. It lasts beyond the personality of a particular leader or organizer, and it means that you're going to have a democracy that can deliver on what people want, which is education, health care, responsive government, all of these things.
And you argue that you got to have a state, you got to have a rule of law, and you got to have accountability.
That's right. I think that there's a kind of miracle in modern politics that we fail to appreciate, because what the state does is it concentrates power. It's the policeman that enforces the laws, but the rule of law limits that power to what the community accepts as norms of justice, and accountability allows you to remove leaders. And so you've got this combination of great power, but power constrained by rules.
You use the example the United States has enough nuclear weapons to create a lot of terror in the world, but it can't do it because it's restrained by the rule of law and accountability.
That's right. That's right. So in a sense, that's been the secret that's missing in a lot of developing countries, that they don't have institutions, they don't have a state that can actually enforce rules, and that's why you get crime and corruption and people living in insecurity.
You go back before states, before human history, and what does that teach you?
Well, I think it teaches you a lot. We have this idea that before you had the state, people were living in this state of war, the war of all against all, and clubbing each other over the head. But it's not true. I think by nature we are social creatures. We have instincts that allow us to live together and to cooperate.
You mean all species, or?
Well, all species have some degree of this, and it's the most highly developed in human beings. And the reason that we've proliferated, and there's now 6-7 billion of us in the world, is precisely because of our social instincts. And so we initially, just like chimpanzees and other primates,
ended up sending Yahoo shares tumbling over the past week. Yahoo is Alibaba's biggest stakeholder, and it says it wasn't informed of Alibaba's spin-off of the Alipay online payment business until the end of March. But Alibaba says Yahoo was there when the board made that decision 2 years ago.
支付宝股权结构的重组
The Alipay restructuring is a lawful and essential action that we need to take. Such a restructuring is a necessary expedite in obtaining an essential regulatory license. This is the first thing. The second thing is that the whole restructuring issue and progress has been discussed with the management board numerous times in meetings.
And to get a toehold in China, Yahoo invested in Alibaba before the company sold shares in Alibaba.com back in 2007. Now, in the years since, Alibaba says it has been trying to buy back Yahoo's stake.
We've been discussing with Yahoo about buying back shares many times, and we started to discuss about it with Yahoo some time ago, and such that I couldn't even remember what their proposal was and what we suggested to them. We just got together and talked about the issue based upon trust between us, but they just suddenly stopped to discuss with us again. It's difficult to tell why, and we honestly do not know why.
Okay, we'll try to chart the markets for this week after this break with Janus Capital. Stay with us on First Up Asia.
We know investment. That's our business. At RCM, we deliver superior and consistent investment